Okay, to assemble the cap chute, you want to start with your stainless rail, your aluminum rail, and attach it with the 1/4 20 bolts here, the button heads, using lock washers. Then attach your right blocks with the 5/16 button heads and lock washers. Run your left and right hand screw into the right side only, bottoming it out, and then take your left block and screw it all the way in. At this point, you can attach your left rail onto the top of the left blocks. Okay, this is what the underside will look like. You'll have to make sure that you get these socket head screws in place, but they cannot protrude through the top. And if you see, we have no gap in between, or very little. At this point, we'll add some new components. These are going to be your tie rod ends, and they will attach to the side of each rod and then attach to the base plate. I like to flip it over for this portion. Make sure that your tapered end is with the open end of the base plate. Now attach each tie rod with a 3/8 fine thread bolt, flathead or flat washer, and a lock washer. You should be seeing something like this. It's okay to leave those 3/8 bolts loose at this time. We'll center it later. In this section, we're going to assemble the top hold down. You'll have 8 1/4 20 socket head bolts by about 3/4 inches long, 8 1/4 inch lock washers, and 2 5/16 flat heads that are 3/4 inches long as well. 4 riser rods, 4 knobs, and the 2 threaded rods. The top hold down, and these 2 brackets. First, we'll use Loctite thread lock on the 2 flathead bolts. It doesn't require much, just a few drops. Then we'll attach the threaded rod to the top hold down. I also forgot to mention the 1/4 inch dowel pin that is 1 inch long that presses into the top hold down. Now we're going to assemble the riser rods to the plates. Okay, you should end up with 2 of these. Now we are going to attach it to the base plate at the rear and the front slots. But before we do that, we must open the chute rails up to allow the top hold down to sit flush in between. Once the top hold down is sitting flush, tighten up the slide rails. And this is what's going to create our center. Now screw a knob on each threaded rod with the shoulder up. attach your assembly over the threaded rod and screw the other two knobs with the shoulder down. Now install the bottom bolts to the riser rods. And I actually switched the 3/4 hex head bolts to 1 inch because the countersink and the riser rods were too deep for the 3/4 bolt. Before tightening, make sure that you have 1 1/16 of an inch on each side of the plate. Now tighten the knobs in order to lock the top hold down into the slide tracks. What that does is allows the slide tracks to be centered to the top hold down, and you can tighten the turnbuckle bolts now, or the tie rod ends, sorry. But before tightening, make sure that your tie rod ends are pushed as close to the threaded part of the rod as it can. That way you don't have any wobble. If you have made it to this point, it looks like you may know what you're doing. We have 0 wobble in here, in between the tie rods. We're perfectly centered to the top hold down. And all of the existing bolts that are there now are tight. Okay, at this point we're going to add our shoulder bolt. It's 1/2 inch shoulder and 1032 threads. It'll go right into this hole here, and will be held in by 2 tiny set screws. It should look like this. Now we're going to insert our spring and our wing nut. And there you have it. The purpose of that is to hold the tongue, but we don't have the tongues formed because it's based on the cap itself, or the variety of caps the customer has. Okay, so now we're going to make assemble the finger blocks. There's a short hole and a much deeper hole. You're going to end up with a left and a right, so it's easier to set it up with both long or deep holes facing you, with the little counter bore. I don't know if you can see it in the video or not, facing up. You'll need the 2 long finger blocks with the bend on it, or the fingers with the bend on it, and then 2 dowel pins with the holes in it. The long so we'll just lay it out kind of so you can see which way it assembles. And the short rod's in the rear. I got one that didn't have a hole in it. I have to switch it. Okay, now I have the correct parts. So the fingers will end up facing each other, and they'll all be held in by those same tiny set screws that you use to hold the shoulder bolt in with. The other critical part to this is this shaft, or the pin should be able to easily go in and out. You should never have to press it, because that's adjustable for certain caps, and you don't want the customer to have to fight it. You should end up with something like this. The set distance here isn't really critical as long as you make them the same. They're going to be adjusted depending upon the cap, and I like to leave the spring hole up, so vertical. And then now we're ready to install the fingers onto the slide rails, and that'll be done with a shoulder bolt. The shoulder bolt that is used is the same 1/4 by 1/2 inch that we previously used. Okay, so after they're tight, you should be able to easily move them, and you should have a little bit of wobble, not much. Okay, now we're going to work on the tension, the finger tension blocks and whatnot. So what we'll want to do is bolt these blocks onto each side, and that'll be done with a 1032 socket head screw. Looks to be about 1.25 inches long. You should have something that looks like this. Now we're going to add this block here on each side. You want the threaded holes up. Obviously it won't pair up the other way. This will be done with a 3/4 length socket head screw of 1032 thread. And your end result should look like this. Now we're going to install the bolt that holds the spring. It should have a little tiny hole in the end of it, and that will go in the back hole on each side. Now we need to add the tension stop bolt. It's an 1.5 inch 1032 socket head screw, and it'll be placed in this hole here. You'll also need a 1032 jam nut. Roll the jam nut on and place the bolt from the inside out, moving your finger all the way open out of the way. Now adjust that bolt until the finger at its furthest closed position is inside of the slide rail. You don't want it to hang over like this. Then tighten your jam nut and it'll be locked in position. You should have something that looks about like that. When it stops, it's not crossing the path of the cap. Now you can add your spring from this dowel pin to the hole in this screw here. And this is the style spring you'll use. Hot dog, boys, there you have it. You got some spring-loaded fingers. Okay, now we're going to put the chain on to drive the slide rails in and out equally. For a left to right capper, your knob will go on your left side. For a right to left capper, your knob will be on the right side. And sprockets will be placed on the opposite side of the knob. You need a 147 pin number 25 chain with one closed link. You'll have to grind a flat onto your shafts where the set screws fall out once you align the chain, and the knob side as well. prior to installing your chain, make sure that your slide rails are brought all the way in close to each other, front and back, so that you know that they're equal. Loosely install your sprockets and place your chain on and close your link. You should be able to tighten the set screws and leave a mark on each of the shafts where a flat has to be ground. Now that you have tightened the set screw, loosen it back up and slide one sprocket off at a time. You should see a mark where the set screw tightened into. That's where you want your flat. Use a grinder with a cutoff wheel to grind a small flat. Place your sprocket back on, tighten it, and do the same to the next sprocket. Now that you've got the flat on both sides and locked in where your flat is, you can tighten the second set screw on each sprocket. Do the same thing with the knob. Tighten your set screw, but I also like to put an 1/8 inch hole into the shaft to add a roll pin. Okay, once you have your hole drilled, insert your roll pin with a punch and a hammer. Make sure it's flush. You should never have to worry about your knob slipping again. You should be able to see your left and right sides opening and closing equally. Okay, now we're going to start working on the mount and adjuster for the capper, where the chute attaches to the capper. We're going to mount it with these 1/4 holes in each of these holes on the base plate. We want the angle to face towards the opening, and we'll use these 1/4 by 3/4 hex head bolts with lock washers. Yeah, just leave those bolts loose for the time being because they're in a slot and we're going to have to center it before we tighten it up. Now we're going to install the bearings into this plate. The bearings have spacers which will go on the top side. The bearings will place through, and you will install snap rings on top and bottom. Now that you have the bearing installed in this plate, that should be what you have. Now we're going to install the guide rods onto this plate here. Countersinks will be on the bottom side, and you'll use a 3/8 flathead bolt. If you've done that correctly, you should have this. Now we're going to put the threaded rod with the thrust bearings into that hole. So you'll want to insert your thrust washer, thrust bearing, thrust washer into the plate, and then onto the shaft you want to install your thrust washer, thrust bearing, and your following thrust washer. Place into the hole and put a 5/16 18 hex head bolt. Back up a little bit. We have to thread this into the plate first, knob being the top side. Okay, now with that accomplished, you can place the thrust washers in the plate and on the knob as shown before. Align your guide rods with your bearings and push the threaded rod through until you can get the bolt on top of these thrust washers. Now if your sub-assembly looks like this, you're ready to go on to the next step. We want to mount those two top holes shown to the two angled bracket holes with 5/16 18 hex head bolts. Now that you've done that, add another bolt with a flathead lock washer, or a flat washer, lock washer, and a hex head. 5/16 18 by about 1 inch long into the slotted hole. Anytime you have a slot, you should use a flat washer. With those last bolts put in, still loose, you should be able to turn this knob and see it adjust easily. There you have it. A full cap chute, minus a tongue, which will be installed once the caps are shown. And actually, I missed a step. Finally, you want to make sure you have 7/8 of an inch between the edge of this plate to the blue plate on both sides. Then tighten the bottom set of screws.